Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Nice to see so many people here. It's probably the largest room I've spoken to since my wedding, so hopefully that will go better. So, shamelessly, I'm going to plug my company, which I'm a shareholder and director of. As you can see there, we've been established since 1963, so we've got over 50 years of history. In the mid-'80s, we ventured into project monitoring surveying, working with a lot of the clearing banks as it was back then, and more niche funders came into the market. Currently, we are overseeing £1.5 billion worth of debt across approximately 370 live projects that we're monitoring. As you can see there, over the last 10 years, we've been involved with 1,300 developments nationwide. And across our offices, we can pretty much cover the whole of the UK, Scotland as well, and Northern Ireland. Very proud to say that we have the largest dedicated project monitoring team, and that is very much at the core of our business, working with developers on a daily basis, just like yourselves. And currently, we're working with 52 lenders. That's a mix of clearing banks and the more niche property funders like Lend Invest. So I'm just going to run through just what we're going to cover very quickly this evening. We're going to just look at common project issues. Won't say failures. Nobody wants a failure. Then I'm going to look at what the key development costs and what constituent parts they are. Look at how the development programme can affect the successful delivery. And then also just a couple of case studies. So the first one, obviously, that is the most simple thing, is to get the construction costs as close as you can correct. When you first get involved with the project, it's very difficult because a lot of the time it will either be based on just budgets of what you consider that you'll need to have in place to complete the development. If you've got a bit more sophistication, you might be able to use a price per square metre or square foot for build costs, depending on what type of development it is. Amazingly, the construction industry and the development world still works largely off square feet, even though we were metric a long time ago. And that I tend to use, whether it be build costs, whether it be sales, a lot of it is all square footage. So when you actually start the project, it will be based on the budgets. And as you go through, you need to flesh those budgets out as and when you either get quotes in for the different subcontract trades, or if you're going out to a main contractor, builder, then you can start to replace that. One of the biggest problems we see is that the costs are not updated against your budget, so you're not reconciling the actual amounts incurred against the budgets you had in place. What that tends to do is you'll run the course of the project, and at the end you'll think, oh, I've run out of money now. And that can obviously affect how either your exit strategy or how you successfully complete the project. A lot of the time, developers are very optimistic in their programs. Optimism is good, but always building in a bit of float is very helpful. There's so many external factors within the construction industry that feed into any form of development that you're not in control of, and it's taking account of that. Even the pre-planning stages, planning, not necessarily an absolute given that it's going to be an 8-week process or a 12-week process. These things can drag on for absolutely no reason. And we touched on earlier about, the planning process is an absolute nightmare. So all these factors really need to be put into a thought process when you're looking at any form of development to give yourself enough time, build in enough float, even whilst on site. Things always happen. Things always come out of the left field and surprise you. And I think always worth remembering that you're a hero when you bring it in on time or even before time. You're never a hero when it's late, especially from a funding point of view. Funders look at that and they say, well, why is it late? So these are very important points to consider. I'm going to dip onto resource issues a bit later, and also the planning side of things on another slide. But one of the careful things to always look at is your procurement route. How much experience you've got as a developer, whether you can manage the subcontract trades, integrate them, getting the trades in at the right times. Otherwise, the project stalls, and then your subcontractors might move on to another job, and then won't be back, and then that just prolongs the whole process. So the alternative to that, obviously, is a contractor. That always comes with a bit of a premium, though. So it's about risk, where you want the risk to be, whether you want to have that risk yourself, manage the process, or alternatively, hand that risk over to somebody else to coordinate. Ultimately, you will end up paying slightly more for that privilege. I think one of the biggest things to look at is, depending on what development you're looking at, is also the suitability of the contractor. Don't always plump for the cheapest price, because sometimes that can be, the worst thing you can do, in the fact that you might have a one-man band builder who might have done some work for you previously, but as you increase and you look at larger, more complex projects, it's a lot of times we see it whereby they take the builder with them, but they don't actually upsize themselves, and it creates there's a requirement for more trades, more resources, a better supply chain as well. And sometimes you'll find that the actual smaller contractors don't have the cash flow to be able to complete the schemes, and you'll end up finding they'll have difficulties, might even be coming to you saying, look, can you pay for this, can you pay for that? And if you're going to a contractor, that's what you should be paying the privilege for their overheads and profit, is to be able to manage those items for you. Make sure that the design is coordinated and fully complete as you can. Otherwise, you'll end up is you'll have trades on site that are not working together. That ends up with repeat work, or having to come back and retake out something to put something else back in. So if you can get the coordination, the design as further down the line as possible, the better. Another main thing really is, if it's any kind of refurbishment, make sure you do your own due diligence on that building prior to purchasing it, whether it be a structural survey, asbestos survey, or if it's new build, a ground investigation report. Ultimately, these are the areas where you will go over budget, because you will not have been able to identify or even put in any kind of provisional sums to make allowances for those works. We covered a lot on that previous slide, but development costs, and you can see what I think the constituent parts of a development appraisal should be. And again, one of the biggest things we always find with developers, once they've done the appraisal, it might be presented to a funder in order to get finance, but then it seems to be put in the top drawer and just forgotten about. It's the most important thing is to continually update that appraisal as and when your costs are updated, whether it be GDV, whether it's construction costs, because at the end of the day, that will identify the profit margin within the scheme, and that's the whole reason that you're venturing into development, is to understand what the profit is in that job. So you can see there, I'm not going to go through, but obviously construction costs, professional fees. What I would highlight out is contingency. Make sure you have a contingency in there, over and above the construction costs. As I said earlier, there is so many things that factor into construction. It is a risky business, so you've got to mitigate those risks. And one of those mitigations is to have a contingency over and above the construction costs. Typically for refurbishments, we would suggest 10% as a contingency on top of the construction costs you've identified. New build, slightly less, 5%. If it's a larger development, whereby you've got a main contractor on board, you could reduce that down to 3%. But there will ultimately always be something that you haven't accounted for. I think when you look at programme, the programme and quality and your costs are all interlinked. I said earlier, with discharge of planning conditions, pre-commencement, it's always a hurdle, massive hurdle, to get planning permission on any development. it doesn't stop there, unfortunately. A majority of the times, there will be pre-commencement conditions that need to be discharged. Those take a time as well in order to submit and then also to get a time to be discharged. Local authorities, with all the cuts that have happened, they're so under pressure, they haven't got enough resource, it ends up taking a lot longer than you anticipate. Problem is, if you start on site, a lot of developers do, if it can affect, and the planners don't tend to like it. So if that does happen and they become aware, your project could come under more scrutiny than you would like. Statutory services providers, so electricity, water, gas, they are a beast unto themselves. They just move at their own pace. So the quicker you can get a quote, the quicker you can get it paid, and you can get them on site, the better. I've had houses finished, and they've been stood there for 12 weeks waiting for electricity connections. And that has stifled the sales, and in some reality, in some cases, they've actually lost the sales, and they've gone elsewhere. So it's very important. Access, we'll move on to access because I'm going to pick it up on a case study, but so you can see. But availability of resources, the construction industry is very buoyant at the moment, and we are seeing a massive skill shortage. That is driving up the price of all of the subcontract trades, whether it be carpenters, plumbers, bricklayers. They are charging very handsomely for carrying out these works. It's not just the construction industry. My profession is a result of the recession that we've seen. We've got to get some more new apprentices in. So I'll just touch on a couple of case studies. So this is 13 new build scheme in the centre of town, high quality development, had a basement structure for underground car parking, very limited space for storage of any materials. So it really needed careful planning. They had a crane on site which had oversailing issues. So all these things, as you get increase in development size, these things all become more of an issue. Even though this was a very well-established developer, they had done a full ground investigation on site. They actually discovered, when they were digging out for the basement, an artesian well, which is essentially an underground spring. And the basement structure became a very big swimming pool for a while. It actually took about 16 weeks to get permission off the Environment Agency to pump the water out into a local watercourse. They lost time, men on site, all cost money, ended up costing the developer £150,000. So it's massive, these things. So what I'm saying is, even if you do as much as you can, the risk is never fully mitigated, really, until you're out of the ground. So hence the reason for contingencies. So just looking at a refurb project that we've been involved with, it was a former care home. Typical of the smaller care homes, they've just not been able to keep up with the Care Quality Commission and their requirements. So it's very typical of the smaller care homes that you see. Actually, this was purchased, it went into receivership or administration, and the developer purchased it from the administrators. Very much similarly, when you do purchase these things, you normally have 2 hours to have a look around it, and that's about it. So there's a limited amount of surveys you can do. Harking back to what I was saying about your own due diligence. Actually, on this one, when they got involved, there was a contractor on board who was a one-man band and had no refurbishment experience. It was a Grade 2 listed building. We actually said, look, no, not suitable. And they said, I think you're right, actually. And so agreed with us, found an alternative who had worked on listed buildings in the past. Turned out when they started stripping back the building, that there was some rot in the timbers, which they had to replace, and also asbestos, which, in most old buildings you would expect to find some asbestos, anything pre-2000. Majority of the buildings there will have some form of asbestos, so it's something you need to account for. It's expensive to get rid of purely because of obviously the health issues around it. Well, thank you very much for listening, everybody. That concludes my part of this evening's entertainment.